What's going on? Alex here. So, I wanted to hop on today and address some of the questions that I've been getting regarding the news that's come out regarding taxes from both the U.S. Treasury and also some of the states have also released their own guidance with regard to some changes that are happening due to this craziness that we're currently experiencing. So, I wanted to get on, address some of the questions that I'm getting, and also answer any questions that you guys have. Feel free to type them down in the chat, and if we have a little bit of time left when this is all over, I'll go ahead and address those. Now, obviously, everybody's going through a lot right now, so I'm not going to turn this into a big spectacle. So what I'm going to do is basically drill down to my thesis right up front, okay? There's the U.S. Treasury putting out provisions saying that certain tax deadlines are going to be extended. Similarly, states are doing the same. Now, if you want the simplest perspective from a tax point of view, it would be prudent if you can, and that's a big asterisk, if you can, ignore all of these extensions completely, meaning that you file by the original deadlines, you pay by the original deadlines, and you don't get caught up in trying to figure out what's what and trying to understand where the new deadlines are going to be held and so forth. So if you want a really simple life from a tax perspective, if you can, and big asterisk, and I'm going to describe what that means a little bit later, then disregard all of these extensions and act as if none of these extensions came to be, and you essentially have the original deadlines to file and pay your taxes. That's going to be the smoothest way forward, trust me. So, what even happened, right? Amongst all the craziness, you may have even missed it. So let's start on the federal tax side of things, okay? And what happened here, and I'm going to switch the view a little bit, is that the U.S. Treasury, Steve Mnuchin specifically, went out and said that there's going to be an extension of 90 days for a good amount of taxpayers out there to pay their taxes, not to file, but to pay. And it doesn't apply to all taxpayers. That's why it's very important to understand the details of this thing. But this just came out today, so we don't have a voluminous amount of information to rely on. We just have what was said at a press conference. So this is all still very new. It's very general. And definitely they're going to put out more detailed provisions. But from what we see now, we can definitely take a look at this and understand to which taxpayers these extensions apply and what exactly they mean. So over here in Bloomberg, we read that the Treasury offers 90 more days to pay, not file, taxes. That deadline in terms of getting the tax returns done, I know people hate to hear this, but you still have to get the returns done on the same date for federal purposes. But in terms of payments, that is going to be extended for some taxpayers. And we're going to get into more detail on that. And it says here that Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin announced that his department is pushing back the April 15th deadline to pay taxes owed for many individuals and businesses, giving them 90 extra days to send checks to the government. This is a very important point, this next paragraph. Individuals can defer up to $1 million of tax liability, and corporations get an extension of up to $10 million. All right? Again, very general in terms of to whom it applies and to whom it doesn't. So if you're an individual who owes $1.5 million in taxes, are you eligible for this at all? Or are you eligible for it to defer up to only the $1 million and you still have to pay the other $500,000 by the deadline? It's not clear, okay? And that's going to be the theme of this entire video, is that it is not clear. Usually when the Treasury or the IRS release guidance, they do so in documents that are 80 pages, 100 pages, even longer than that. And with that said, we have a lot of detail to go on and understand various situations and how they play out. Right now, very general. We have very few details to go by. So take all of this information with a grain of salt, in that we have kind of the skeleton of what's going to happen from a tax perspective, but we don't have those juicy details that we want just yet. All right. So obviously this is an attempt to create some stimulus within the economy because of everything that's going on. And they're saying here that all you have to do is file your taxes. You'll automatically not get charged interest and penalties. Now, as we go through this, I'm going to raise some questions because as a tax professional, this raises more questions than it answers. So from that perspective, we'll go through all those items one by one to make sure that if you are looking to have this benefit you, that you don't end up in a situation where you misunderstand a certain provision and you may end up with penalties and interest anyway. All right, so going through here, let's see if there's anything else important. Okay, so that's pretty much the federal side of things. So essentially what the Treasury Department has said is that there is a 90-day extension to pay taxes, but you still have to file by the original April 15th deadline. I am going to get into some of the questions that raises, but that's the idea for now. Stay with me. We're going to come right back to it. I did also want to talk about the fact that states have enacted their own provisions, some of them, and it's important to note that the states may honor the federal timeline. They may not honor it. They may do nothing at all. So whichever state you live in, you need to check what they're doing at the state level. Now, California, I'm in California. Majority of my clients are in California, so that's the state I'm going to talk about. But do the research on your respective state to understand what they're doing. So in California, they released this, and actually, Franchise Tax Board moved before the federal government when it comes to these provisions to help taxpayers. And this is the Franchise Tax Board website, more time to file and pay for California taxpayers affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. There are a few key words there that are very important. We're going to parse through those, but let's just read a little bit here. And it says, the Franchise Tax Board, and I washed my hands profusely before this webcast, believe me, says the Franchise Tax Board announced today special tax relief for California taxpayers affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Affected taxpayers are granted an extension to file 2019 federal taxes and make certain payments until June 15, 2020. So this is talking about filing and paying, all right? That's why it's different than the federal provision, which just extended the payment aspect of things. All right, so this is in line with a March 12th executive order put out by the governor in California. And here are the crucial details here, and let's make sure that this is visible for you guys. All right, so it says this relief includes moving the various tax filing and payment deadlines that occur on March 15th, 2020 through June 15th, 2020 to June 15th, 2020. Okay, so basically they're saying that if there's a deadline that you had to adhere to in terms of filing or payment that fell from March 15th to June 15th, 2020, then you have until June 15th, 2020. All right, so there's a little bit of relief there. Then, depending on what kind of business you have, that's also going to have an effect on things. It says partnerships and LLCs who are taxed as partnerships, whose tax returns are due on March 15th, now have a 90-day extension to file and pay by June 15th. And this came out before March 15th, so some of this already may not be as applicable, but still it's important to understand. Next, individual filers whose tax returns are due on April 15th now have a 60-day extension to file and pay by June 15th. All right. And thirdly, quarterly estimated tax payments due on April 15th now have a 60-day extension to pay by June 15th. All right. So those are the basic provisions. And it says here the FTB will also waive interest and any late filing or late payment penalties that would otherwise apply. And importantly, they're saying that taxpayers claiming the special COVID-19 relief should write the name of the state of emergency, for example, COVID-19, in black ink at the top of the tax return to alert the FTB of the special extension period. If taxpayers are e-filing, they should follow the software instructions to enter disaster information. Obviously, our lawmakers are trying to steady this boat right now. There's a lot of turbulence happening, and they're trying to do their best in terms of softening the blow for a lot of people, so to speak. However, as a tax professional, having seen some emergency measures put in place at the last minute and how that plays out later on, sometimes these provisions create more problems than they create solutions, really. And here's why. Going back to the federal side of things, it's great that they provided the 90-day extension to pay. But in terms of filing, you still need to take care of that on time. So it's a very important distinction. And what can happen is if you're thinking about applying this relief at the federal level and at the California level, now you have different deadlines for filing your returns, right? Because the federal government did not extend the filing deadline. California did. And now you have to keep track of all of that. Typically, to keep things simple, we like to keep things as simple as possible for clients because things are complicated enough. We like to have things coincide when possible, right? So if we're filing the federal return, we're probably filing the California return at the same time just to make sure that there's nothing forgotten and there are no issues. With this, now there's two separate deadlines. It can create a lot of confusion with regard to, okay, well, we filed the federal. I thought this was taken care of. And then a few months later, you have to worry about California. So the idea is nice, but practicality always wins. And in that case, it may be prudent, just as I mentioned in the beginning, to pretend that this doesn't exist if you possibly can, and obey the original filing and payment deadlines. Is going to make your life a whole lot easier, I promise you. All right, another concern here is that the states may not abide by the extended deadlines, or they may offer varying payment and or filing terms. All right, so you got to be very careful. If you live in California, we already discussed some of the provisions there. But if you have multi-state returns, let's say you worked in 5, 7 different states, 13 different states, some of those may provide some sort of relief, some of those may not. You may have estimated payment obligations in those various states, so you don't want to get, in my opinion, too fancy in terms of applying these relief provisions. Again, I said in the very beginning, if you can, those are the key words, and I'm going to come back to that and explain exactly what that means. But this is an example of some situations where this can get particularly hairy, even though the intentions are good. I like the intentions. From a tax perspective, putting this all together, sometimes it becomes a little messy, unfortunately. The other question is, what effect does this have on estimated tax payments, right? April 15th is the filing deadline and the payment deadline if you owe taxes for 2019. But it's also the payment deadline for the first estimated payment for tax year 2020. Now, they're saying that they're extending some of the payment deadlines. If that is the case, that means you're simply going to kick the can down the road to make even a larger payment on June 15th, right? Because if you extended the payment date to, let's say, June 15th, and you didn't make the April 15th payment, now you're doubling up on that. And that can create a cash flow issue for some people if they go ahead and spend that payment that they would have made on April 15th. Now they're waiting till June. You still have to make that, what would have been the second payment and the first payment for 2020 on June 15th. So you got to be careful about that. It can create sort of a bunching up of those payments, and you got to make sure that you don't put yourself into a difficult cash flow situation. So estimated payments can get a little bit tricky in this regard. And at the federal level, it's one thing. At the state level, it's a different thing because California, let's remember, it's not 25% every quarter. California has a different schedule for estimated income tax payments at the personal level. So you have 30% due typically on April 15th. You have 40% due on June 15th, 30% due on September 15th, and another, 0 due on September 15th, and then another 30% due on January 15th of the next year. But when you take the schedule and you flip it on its head, now you're bunching up payments. You got to remember, if you're taking care of the federal and the state tax liabilities, it can get a little crazy. So when they're saying that they are extending the payment schedule, my question is, how does that affect estimated income tax payments for tax year 2020? And if those are also extended, you got to make sure that it doesn't create difficult cash flow issues for taxpayers. Next, there's some people out there that have installment agreements where they're paying the IRS for prior tax years and they're making regular payments. And the question is, well, now there's sort of some tax relief available. Can we stop making payments? I'm going to boil it down and say you're better off continuing making those installment agreement payments. Okay, don't stop, because so far nothing has been said about it. If something's said about it later, then we'll handle that when it happens. But don't just jump the gun and say, well, if they're offering relief here, they'll offer relief here. It's not necessarily the case. So what I would do then is be very careful with the installment agreement payments. Make sure that if you've been paying them, you continue paying them. You don't want any problems there, regardless of whatever provisions are put out there. Next, there might be extending some payment deadlines, filing deadlines at the federal and state levels. How does that affect the timing of retirement plan contributions? If you're, let's say, self-employed, you have to make contributions to an IRA, to a SEP, what have you, 401k. How does that affect, how do these changes affect that? And that's something we also need to take into account. We don't know. There's very few details about it right now. But again, from a federal perspective and a state perspective, when they're not aligned, this can get very complicated, very tricky, very quickly. Next, there are taxpayers who filed their returns and they enabled auto withdrawal of taxes on April 15, 2020. Now, are those automatic payments going to be honored or not? It's a great question. We don't know. So at this point, if you typically have a payment taken out on April 15th, but now we have this provision whereby there's more time allowed to pay, is that payment going to be taken out? Do you have to cancel it? There's just some questions, and they'll be answered, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But again, if you have payments that are scheduled to be auto withdrawn from your bank accounts, you'd want to understand if those are actually going to be made or if they're going to be skipped for whatever reason, and there could be some issues there. Also, if you don't want to make those payments, you have to figure out how you can go about canceling them. Typically, on the federal level, you can cancel them within about 2 days prior to the date of the payment. But again, consult with your tax advisor. Super important to make sure that you don't jump on a landmine with regard to all these different deadlines moving all over the place. And finally, fiscal year entities. Not every entity ends their year on December 31st. Some entities ended on end of February, end of March, end of April. And the question is, how does this provision affect those businesses? Is it across the board extension of the 90 days? Is it only for returns and payments that go from this date to this date? Again, very unclear. This is all new, but yet another consideration to take into account. So if you have a fiscal year entity, definitely want to make sure you navigate the waters carefully. All right. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that you can avoid all this hassle by just pretending that these extension provisions and these relief provisions didn't exist and filing by the original deadlines and paying by the original deadlines. And I preface that statement by saying the words, if you can. It's tough out there right now. And if making that tax payment is going to put you into a precarious situation in terms of cash flow 3 months from now, 6 months from now, then that's something to take into account as well. Because we need to think a bit more long-term with this thing. We just don't know about what's going to happen. So it's important to consider whether you have the capacity to just pretend that none of this exists. So if making a tax payment is going to put you into a tight squeeze and you want to take advantage of these provisions, my advice is to tread lightly, consult with your tax advisor to make sure that, hey, are we good on the federal level? Okay, what are we doing at the state level? All right, when are we filing? When are we paying? And make sure that it all makes sense, because you still have to take into account tax year 2020, any estimated payments that you may have to make as a self-employed individual or as a business owner, what have you. And those are all things that come into play. And again, it's great that they put out these provisions, but in practice, there's a lot of nitty-gritty that has to be understood to implement it and not end up in a situation where you're slapping your forehead a few months down the line because you either forgot to file on time or you missed a deadline and so forth. And there is definitely benefits to filing on time. And what I mean there is a lot of the provisions in the tax code, they are preferential to returns that are timely filed. So you'll see a whole bunch of text and it'll say based on a timely filed return or as included with a timely filed return. So it's super important to meet tax deadlines, even if you file an extension by the deadline. Super important not to file late returns because you lose access to so many different provisions that may be beneficial to you. So again, be super careful if you're navigating this stuff because it can get sort of tricky. Now, going back to California here, I'm going to put the screen up. And we're going to examine this a little bit more closely because if you go to this page right here, it talks about if you're affected for California purposes by COVID-19. Now, what does that mean? Of course, from a human perspective, we're all affected, clearly, right? I don't think anybody out there doesn't know what's going on and isn't affected. But from a tax perspective, we're talking about the FTB's perspective, the Franchise Tax Board. I don't think there's a more vicious tax collection agency out there than the FTB. Are they going to feel like you were affected? So they have a frequently asked questions. If you go on the top of this page, you click this link right here, it takes you to this wonderful page, and it says frequently asked questions. Now, what business entities qualify for the June 15, 2020 extended deadline to file and pay taxes? Again, let's remember, California extended the deadline to file and pay. Again, a lot of different questions that come up there, but in a very general sense, this is what they did. It says the new extensions announced on March 13th news release apply to any business entity with a California return or payment due between March 15th and June 15th. This includes corporations, S-corps, LLCs, partnerships, and other entity types with returns due during this period. Okay? Now, how does the FTB define who is, quote, affected by the COVID-19 pandemic? How would they need to demonstrate this? You can get creative with your imagination, but here's what they say. A taxpayer does not have to be, let me make sure you can see this, a taxpayer does not have to be directly impacted. Taxpayers who experience any difficulty in filing or paying as a result of COVID-19 are included in this relief. For example, some taxpayers may not be able to get their tax returns prepared due to the unavailability of their paid tax preparers or through free paid tax preparation programs. Quarantine or infection could also affect someone's ability to file or pay on time. Taxpayers will self-identify on their tax returns as they do with other natural disasters. So, is the FTB likely to challenge a swath of taxpayers out there with regard to if they were affected by COVID-19? I'm not sure it's super likely, but I wouldn't take it outside the realm of possibility. Okay, again, I've seen things from the FTB in particular that have stunned me. All right, and they are exceptionally vicious. And if there was a significant amount of money at stake, I wouldn't put it past them to pursue taxpayers and say, you really weren't affected that much. So you don't want to be in a situation where you have to justify to the FTB of all things that you were indeed put into a precarious situation. So hopefully this adds a little bit of clarity and perspective to all of these provisions that were put out. I think the important thing to consider is if you have the capacity, if you have the ability to pretend that these relief provisions don't exist and that they were never enacted or put out or anything, and you file and pay by the original deadlines, that's probably going to be the simplest thing for you from a tax perspective. Now, if you can, all right? So some people are in a very difficult spot right now, and their business is suffering. They've been laid off. They have rent to pay. There's all sorts of different things that may be applicable. So take this all then with a grain of salt, because you don't want to be in a bind later on because you chose to ignore these provisions that have been put out. So if this is something you need, consult with your tax professional to make sure it's done right. And make sure that you put the money aside so that when it comes time to pay, and you may need to make a double payment if you make estimated tax payments, make sure you're in a good position, all right? And it's going to involve a little bit of planning. And again, it's going to involve having a tax professional guide you as to where you are safe to take advantage of the relief or when it's better to just, hey, let's bite the bullet if we can. Big asterisk there. And let's just keep it simple. But if this is relief that you need, certainly make sure that you did it right by consulting with your tax professional. Now, what else did I want to bring up here? I think that was it for now. See if there's any questions that I can address. All right. take a look at my notes here. All right. Yeah, that's pretty much it for now. Now, I do have clients who are doctors, and one of them did inform me that based on what's going on, it's definitely beneficial to partake in social distancing. So definitely, if you can, partake in this process to try to mitigate this craziness that we're all in. Partake in that social distancing, and thank you. You know the doctor I'm talking about. You might be watching. So with that, if you have questions, definitely feel free to reach out. We're here to help. And certainly, if you're in a situation where you are looking to take advantage of the relief, make sure that we work together to make sure it's done right. We don't want any negative consequences to come out of this. Even though it's meant to be beneficial, sometimes the mechanics can get in the way of taking advantage of things like this in a time of need. So hopefully that was helpful, and I will be releasing additional updates as we go through this with some more details that come out. And stick with me. We'll get you through this. Hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching.